All right, let's move on to some news actually out of Harvard that we wanted to pair with the interview Bari Weiss conducted with Jerry Seinfeld over at the Free Press yesterday. So just to contextualize this, we're going to be talking about Harvard starting to say we are going to have a policy of institutional neutrality along the lines of, something like the University of Chicago, although important observers have pointed out something important, which is that we don't know how Harvard will interpret this yet. But obviously, Harvard has been reeling since the Claudine Gay testimony after October 7th, then the encampments, and it's been a hell of a year for Harvard. Now, in his interview with Bari Weiss, Jerry Seinfeld, who just gave a majorly viral commencement address at Duke University, addressed some of what he sees among young people. Let's roll this clip.
And so you yourself have become politicized in a way.
A little bit, yeah.
Do you feel that?
I do.
You comfortable with it?
It's so dumb. It's so dumb. In fact, when we get protesters occasionally, I love to say to the audience, I love that these young people, they're trying to get engaged with politics. We have to just correct their aim a little bit. They don't seem to understand that as comedians, we really don't control anything.
Right, right.
No one's really...
No, you're pulling the strings over the war in Gaza,
yeah.
Right? That's how I think of you.
Yeah.
You were in Israel
yes.
since the war started. How was that trip?
The most powerful experience of my life.
Really?
I'm sure, yeah.
Why?
You just...
That clip was shared by Israel's official Twitter account.
Yes.
And then the conversation went on from there. We could roll this next clip from it.
A huge part of the way you think about comedy is how the audience never lies.
Right.
But what happens if a lot of people are wrong? In other words, I don't think Jews do well in an age of mobs. And I feel that right now in our culture, it's really easy to form mobs.
Yes, really easy.
And what's the difference between the audience never lying, but when does the audience kind of tip into the mob? Do you see where I'm going with that?
I do.
There's something...
Yeah.
But I really have been wanting to ask you about, for someone that relies on the truth-telling of the audience to tell you whether or not something is funny, what does that same principle apply to a mass of people? You see what I mean?
Well, you can't act like we don't see this every day in many realms. Let's just talk politically, left and right. You're watching mobs. They're mobs. They're mobs believing their own crap, right?
Yeah.
That's what a political party is. We're going to make up a bunch of nonsense and we'll all agree to it, right? Right. Okay, let's print up some bumper stickers and get out there, kids. That's politics. So we're tribal animals. We're social creatures. We look for agreement and consensus. We're driven by agreement and consensus, and mob rule gives us comfort, gives us certainty.
Yeah.
It's all BS.
I can actually say to the point about Seinfeld explaining that his trip to Israel after October 7th was the most powerful experience of his life. I can imagine that's true, basically no matter who you are. I mean, humanitarian tragedy, catastrophe that unfolded after October 7th. Your point about Israel sharing the clip, the Israeli government sharing the clip on X, I think is really interesting as well. But the second part of that is what you added that to the show. You wanted to hear what he said about mob rule. There was a walkout in his speech at Duke, actually. People just walked out of it, which it seemed like he was alluding to.
Yeah.
What stood out to you in that argument about mob rule?
Yeah, and my view on the whole Seinfeld thing was that I think it was, so the reason that the pro-Palestine protesters started going after Seinfeld is that he was kind of outspoken in support of the Israeli war effort, but also his wife was directly funding the campus counter protests, and those counter protests like actually genuinely got violent and were quite vile in their kind of Islamophobic rhetoric and sometimes anti-Semitic rhetoric. So to protest against, like, you know, you're putting yourself in the arena if you're financing counter protests. And
Yes.
but my view on it was people don't,
As a billionaire,
Yeah.
by the way. Yes.
I'm sure, yeah, she's got that Seinfeld money.
Yep.
But my view of it was people don't really know that, and they're just going to think you're just protesting Seinfeld because he's Jewish, which isn't what people were doing, because they had this organized, this specific reason for it. But I thought it would blow up in their face if they went forward with it. And then I thought it was interesting to hear kind of Seinfeld's own kind of political analysis, just to show how vacuous it is. Like, to say that that all political parties and the political formations are just mere tribal associations of people organizing together just to make themselves feel good and get that sense of camaraderie, ignores everything we know about, like, political movements and political parties. Like, there are actual agendas, and there are things that people are fighting for, materially, spiritually, and so to, like, ignore that just shows, like, it kind of makes his point in some ways that that he really is not anybody who's, like, really deeply, you know, thought about politics ever. So it's like, yeah, he is kind of, but so many comedians, of course, are very political. Comedy is very often political.
Yes.
If there's any comedian who's been apolitical, it has been Seinfeld. You know, just talking about, you know, how,
But not so much
how it sucks to, like, fly on airplanes.
It's not so much apolitical as transpolitical, in that it's transpartisan, I guess. You know, it sort of reminds me of the Johnny Carson approach, which was really popular in the era of mass media. Like, that's the example when I talk to students about this that I always use, is like, Johnny Carson was constantly political, just it wasn't partisan humor. It wasn't like Stephen Colbert, who is now the #1 host in late night, like, in the Johnny Carson slot, because we're not in the era of mass media anymore. And I feel like Seinfeld is really struggling with that, the new reality that people in these niches, you know, maybe they represent 20 or 30% of the country, now have abolished a lot of gatekeeping and are ascendant. And, you know, when people walk out of his Duke commencement speech, that gets a lot of headlines because a lot of the gatekeepers are gone and new media can write about it. We can talk about it here. And I think that's it's a really new world for him. In fact, he said in the Duke speech, the slightly uncomfortable feeling of awkward humor is okay. It's not something you need to fix. I totally admire the ambitions of your generation to create a more just and inclusive society. I think it is also wonderful that you care so much about not hurting other people's feelings in the 1,000,001 ways we all do that every second of every day. It's lovely to want to fix those things, but all caps. But what I need to tell you as a comedian, do not lose your sense of humor. You can have no idea at this point in your life how much you're going to need it to get through. Not enough of life makes sense for you to be able to survive it without humor. I think you and I both agree with those sentiments exactly, but it's not arguing against the point that his opponents are making, which is that there's just nothing funny about, like, that was what they're arguing, is they're talking about genocide. And they walked out of a speech because of genocide. They opposed the speech because of what they see as genocide. And so coming back at that by saying, hey, just let your hair down.
Yeah, and I don't really even think his show was transpartisan, in the sense that, like, take him at his word. Like, he was saying, it was a show about nothing. And in the 90s, the country really was ready for a show about nothing.
But he didn't. There was political. He would make jokes about political things. It wasn't in your face, but, like, there were jokes about history and politics, and they would, you know, there were.
I guess, but it's just completely shorn of any meaning whatsoever.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think that's what's interesting.
As Larry David has continued the theme of, like, just a completely trivial show, but he dives into political issues.
Yes.
Because I think because you have to now, because of the polarized political climate we're in. And Seinfeld is on this belated kind of anti-woke theme now.
Although he was there early, like I think in 2015 or
Was he?
2016,
I
he
missed
came
that.
out and said, "I'm not doing campuses anymore." I think it was like Seinfeld and Chris Rock said that in 2015.
Because Seinfeld was getting canceled. Like, what was Seinfeld saying?
I think he was saying people didn't have a good sense of humor. So I feel like he's been on that, but he's not realizing that maybe they do have a sense of humor. I mean, there are some people I think probably do need a sense of humor, but it's just, or a better sense of humor, but it's just that the things that he wants to talk about, people aren't seeing the humor in those particular
and also
things.
his post-Seinfeld stand-up was, like, I'm not saying anything controversial, it just hasn't been that good. Like, it's not, like, he hasn't been that, like, great. And it's made a lot of people say, wait a minute, was it really Larry David?
The whole time.
that was the genius behind that show the whole time?
I've never been a huge Seinfeld person. I love Curb. Never been a huge Seinfeld person, but I think you can. He's obviously very smart, and I think I agree with you that
I don't think he's thought through some of this stuff, but yeah.
Maybe where we agree on this is that I really think he's struggling to deal with the new reality of the country. Like it's not the country of the 1990s when his show was like extraordinarily popular. And Seinfeld is still popular. Barry made that point in the Free Press post. It's still extremely popular, but that doesn't, we're so nicheified that it's not the same thing as people all sitting down at 9 p.m. and tuning into Seinfeld and talking about it at the water cooler the next day. He really has to grapple with the lack of gatekeeping and what that means for a culture that's going in a million different directions. It's not like, hey, we can all have a good laugh about this, joke in regard to silly, crazy conservatives. It's more like people are on wildly different pages.
And he's got to grapple with not having Larry David.
Yeah, that's probably the real handicap.
That's really struggling.
Yeah, probably the real handicap there.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.